Thanks again for inviting me to speak for this half hour or so. And I'm going to give a sort of a lightning introduction to medical device security, which should complement pretty well what you just heard from my HS colleague. So let's get right into it. And so this will be a US-centric talk, but you're going to see there's some international sides as well. And I think you'll be able to see how this relates to IoT on a safety critical side. So I'm not going to read my whole bio. You already did a lot of that anyway. But if you want to go back and look at the slides, you can see my engineering background. I am Acting Director, Medical Device Cybersecurity at FDA, on loan from the University of Michigan, where I'm a professor of electrical engineering and computer science. So I look back in time at some of the talks I've given to forums such as this on medical device security. And I noticed that it's been almost 10 years and my advice has not changed at all. And that is, in my view, the biggest risk to medical device security, or what your community might call the Internet of Medical Things, would be wide-scale unavailability to deliver patient care and the integrity of medical sensors used in diagnosis and therapy. Dovetailing on the last talk about ransomware, it's pretty clear we didn't know 10 years ago that ransomware would be such a big challenge this year, but it certainly emphasized, unfortunately, that wide-scale unavailability of patient care is a significant driving risk. Now, we haven't yet seen, I would say, widespread problems of integrity of medical sensors, but my track record's pretty solid, and I usually am able to predict about 10 or 20 years ahead of time. So I do believe that's a battle or a war we need to prepare for. But the main message is that it's extremely difficult to bolt security on after the fact in an IoT device, let alone a medical device. And you really need to build it in by design. It needs to be deliberate. It's very challenging to put security on after the fact. So let me get right into sort of the FDA perspective. So at the Food and Drug Administration, we have the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, and we regulate the entire US market of medical devices. The definition of medical device is a little bit different from, say, the UK legal definition, but you can think of it as roughly the sphere of non-chemical devices that do therapies or treatment for some medical related things. So there's an official legal definition, but that's sort of the rough sphere. And to give you an idea of just how big that is, within CDRH, we have about 1,500 technical reviewers to look at pre-market clearance and pre-market approval of medical devices that are wishing to reach the US market. And I believe it's something on the order of 60 to 70 billion a year in imports and another 60 to 70 billion a year in exports with medical devices in the US. I think one of the revolutionary observations in the last couple of years has been that, let me give you sort of the legalese and I'll explain what this means. FDA has found 510K submissions to be deemed not substantially equivalent and not approvable solely based on cybersecurity concerns. Now, what does that mean in human speak? What that means is there are several regulatory pathways for a manufacturer to get a medical device cleared or approved for the US market. And there have been pre-market submissions that have just been deemed not to reach the US market because of a cybersecurity concern alone. In other words, you cannot ignore cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is really important for any device with a clinical risk. And the reason for that is that cybersecurity is a key part of safety. In the United States, FDA has the remit from our Congress to regulate the safety and efficacy of medical devices. And because it's extremely difficult to have a safe device if you don't have cybersecurity of clinically relevant aspects, that is why it's so closely tied to safety. So what has FDA done to try to help bring more consistency to expectations of security of medical devices? Well, over the last 8 years or so, we've published several documents. In FDA parlance, we have something called a guidance document. And if you say the word guidance in the legal circles of FDA, it has a very specific meaning. It's a document that goes through very rigorous review public feedback, and then it's finalized. And we have two guidance documents related to medical device security. The first one is called pre-market. We call it the pre-market guidance, and it's basically all the engineering that you do ahead of time before putting a device on the market. So it asks questions about what's the threat model, what are some of the risks being considered, what are the uncontrolled risks and controlled risks, depending upon various technical matters. It's very design oriented. So it's for the engineering minded persons in a medical device manufacturer. The second guidance document that FDA finalized way back in 2016 is called the post-market. And so post-market to us means, okay, a medical device has been cleared or approved for the US market, and a problem comes up somewhere later. Perhaps it might require a recall, perhaps it requires an advisory, or perhaps it just requires a relatively routine software update. So the post-market guidance goes into what I would consider sort of the social contract of what are effective ways to coordinate disclosure of vulnerabilities and incidents. And there are a lot of stakeholders: security researchers, health delivery organizations, patients, physicians, regulators, law enforcement. In the US, we have the Department of Homeland Security. And this document talks about ways to do that kind of effective communication with the goal of protecting the safety and efficacy of the medical devices for patient care. So I'm going to go through several, I would say, initiatives that either we're working on within FDA, or FDA has stood up, or FDA is a major stakeholder to help improve medical device security. And if there is one thing I would say needs to be done that has the most bang for the buck, it's threat modeling. Threat modeling is an art and a science based in computer security, science, and engineering. And it's all about, it's the analog to hazard analysis. So if you're a safety expert, you'll know about the term hazard analysis. In the computer security world, it's about identifying threats and modeling the adversary. And it's very tricky to do, but it's also very important to do, because if you don't do threat modeling, then you cannot scientifically say whether an approach or solution you've purchased or programmed is actually doing what you need it to do. And so threat modeling brings more science to protecting systems from computer security problems. So we stood up an initiative through the Medical Device Innovation Consortium and MITRE to do what we called a series of boot camps, where we trained new trainers from medical device manufacturers about how to integrate threat modeling into the manufacturing processes. This was attended internationally by medical device manufacturers. And we just announced a couple weeks ago an output of this is a playbook. It's not yet publicly available, but it will be shortly. A written document based upon the boot camps to help manufacturers understand how to integrate threat modeling into their manufacturing practices. Now, it may have application to the general IoT community as well. Certainly, we have a standard of safety, and for an IoT device, it would be nice to have safety. But I would imagine maybe the general IoT devices being less rigorous. But there could be many things that the general IoT community could learn from this threat modeling playbook to be more deliberate about designing security and privacy into a product. Very relevant to this venue is the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, known as the IMDRF. This is the international component for regulating medical devices. There are a number of initiatives. We meet about every 2 weeks now on various issues ranging from how to cope with legacy software and hospitals' legacy medical devices that are effectively unpatchable, where you will have uncontrolled risk. And then issues such as software bill of materials, which I'll get into in just a moment. But the key part about the IMDRF is helping to bring more consistency to the policies and regulations across the various borders, so that a manufacturer is less likely have to design 300 radically different products, but at least have some kind of common baseline for expectations of cybersecurity. So I mentioned Sbomb, and if you haven't heard of Sbomb, you'll be hearing about it soon, because it's deeply encoded in, at least in the United States, in executive orders from the US president. and it's beginning to become deeply encoded in international standards. It's the software bill of materials. And you can think of this as an ingredient list of what's on the inside of a device, what third-party or maybe fourth-party software is on the inside and bears some risk to the end user. And there are many different use cases for an Sbomb. One use case is if a vulnerability comes out in the future, it's much easier for a manufacturer to ascertain, hey, am I at risk because there's a hole in OpenSSL, or am I at risk because the C++ compiler has this particular vulnerability? It's going to enable a movement away from sort of hair on fire reaction to the routine computer security vulnerability to something much more streamlined. But there are other aspects as well for use cases, such as in a hospital or a health delivery organization. They can ask for an Sbomb from a manufacturer, and that way the HDO can better ascertain what risks are they taking on when they put a medical device on their clinical network. That way they know better about what's on the inside, what versions of the software are, how well patched things are. There's several other use cases, but I think the high-level message is that Sbomb is the details of how Sbomb will be implemented are still being debated. But Sbomb is here to stay and is likely to be growing exponentially in importance. In the United States, the FDA helped stand up a group called the Health Sector Coordinating Council. I would say if you're in the healthcare security space, you need to be part of the HSCC. It's a very good and streamlined forum of all the forums I'm aware of for sharing information and really consensus documents about computer security for medical devices, as well as the larger healthcare ecosystem. So the Joint Security Plan is a security development lifecycle framework designed for the medical device space. So you may have heard of companies like Microsoft in the early 2000s innovating the very early concepts of what is a security development lifecycle. Well, now there's one for medical devices. And the beauty is, if you're a manufacturer and you're relatively new to medical device security, or maybe you're a new CISO of a medical device company or a product security manager, and you're being told by your boss, okay, you need to stand up a medical device security program and tell me how many million you need for your budget. Well, this joint security plan is a great template, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel. And you can find it down there at that URL, healthsectorcouncil.org/the joint security plan. And I highly recommend it, even if you've created your own security program within your manufacturing facility. It's a good document to read so you can figure out, hey, are there any holes in your thinking that you might need to revise in your processes, everything from the early design work all the way through to post-market and managing security risks when vulnerabilities come out in third-party components of your product. So handy document. I highly recommend Joint Security Plan. Okay, well, let me return to my favorite topic of threat modeling and why it's just so important for, at least in the medical device space, having an effective submission to the US Food and Drug Administration if you'd like to put a medical device on the US market. And likely this is going to be the case internationally. It's certainly growing as common internationally. And so the reason, again, that we harp so much on threat models is because it's the place where you can have the strongest science for understanding the effectiveness of those cybersecurity controls. So if you take a look at some of the consensus documents, standards that the FDA recognizes, there's one called the AIMI TIR 57. This is the Association for the Advancement of Medical Instrumentation, and Technical Information Report 57 just refers to this standard that's about pre-market engineering for a medical device for cybersecurity. And it talks about things such as how do you identify, analyze, and evaluate potential security risks? Because it's no longer acceptable to say we don't have cybersecurity risk. We know that can't be true because everything has a cybersecurity risk. The more important question is how to identify them, categorize them, and stratify them. So for instance, the the standard talks about how to rank security risk as either acceptable, conditionally acceptable, or unacceptable. And the whole idea is to move away from this sort of 1990s mentality of gut judgment assessments towards something that's verifiable, where a third party could even verify your claims of a security design control without having to share your gut judgment. And in my view, it's simply impossible to make scientific claims of cybersecurity unless you have a refutable threat model. So let me go through a few examples of what I would consider very poor threat models. If a student were in my class and proposed one of these, I'd probably fail them. And then I'll give you an example of sort of a good beginning of a threat model. And hopefully by the end of this, you'll understand what the meme on the right is, if you haven't seen this before, about inappropriate threat models. So at FDA, we've seen a number of interesting submissions, and there are a couple common themes of sort of broken threat models. One of the more broken ones would be we see a claim such as, well, we use an obscure programming language so nobody could hack us, or nobody would find that. That's simply not science. It's also not refutable. It's just stating what you did. That's not the same thing as science. We've also seen claims such as, well, we've never been attacked, so we don't need to worry about computer security. Again, that is a very 1990s quaint approach to cybersecurity. It's not science, nor is it refutable, and it's also probably wrong, because it turns out if you have not been attacked, you're actually more likely to be attacked because you tend to be complacent and resting on the fact that you just haven't noticed you've been attacked. Everybody's been attacked. It's more about, just like with cybersecurity risk, everything has risk. It's more about stratifying that and managing it. A more subtle flawed threat model would be, our product must be placed on a secure hospital network. And at first glance, this may seem like a very reasonable threat model. But if you dig a little bit deeper, you'll discover it's extremely flawed. And the reason why is computer networks are inherently hostile. It doesn't matter if you're on a VPN. It doesn't matter if you're behind a firewall. It's inherently hostile. In fact, if you look at some of the computer security vulnerabilities in firewalls, I found one firewall product that has 50 pages of different security vulnerabilities in the firewall itself. So you simply cannot trust a network, and a medical device needs to remain safe and effective even if that network is compromised. So I think a much better threat model, which is something we teach in the university and we know how to build, so I know it's possible because I've done it, is we say, well, we begin by assuming an adversary can control the network with the ability to alter, drop, and replay packets. This gets away from a lot of the gut judgment approaches of computer security to something much more engineering oriented, where you can have much more deliberate cybersecurity controls for the risks you know are there. The other good thing is, notice I don't mention any particular CVEs or particular vulnerabilities. A threat model mentioning particular vulnerabilities is not a good way to start, because it's very reactive and you're trying to protect about yesterday when you need to be protecting about tomorrow. By having a general threat model about properties rather than about specific vulnerabilities, you can actually protect against unknown risks in the future. So here, for instance, you're able to protect against any particular malware in the future that might compromise your network, regardless of the particular mechanism. So threat modeling is key for medical device security. I'll just go through a few more items and be glad to take any Q&A. You can go ahead and, if you just search for FDA cybersecurity, you'll probably see our landing page pop up at the Digital Health Center of Excellence. And I encourage you to read this five-page report that we wrote in response to a presidential executive order on cybersecurity. It's a handy document because it contains basically all the references you'd ever need to get started on understanding cybersecurity for medical devices. So I highly recommend you read our response to NIST if you'd like to get a start on everything you should know from a regulatory perspective on medical device security. And I have some engineering advice. I don't think we're going to have time to go into it today, but suffice to say, pretty much every problem I've seen boils down to not following one of the principles from a paper written almost 50 years ago called Protection of Information Computer Systems in the Proceedings of the IEEE. And it goes through 8 key engineering principles. And if you follow these principles, you're likely to have much smoother sailing. If you don't follow these principles, you're likely to have some serious post-market issues, vulnerability management, potential recalls. It's just opening yourself up to problems if you don't follow some of the 50 years of advice on computer security. I'd be glad to talk about that perhaps in another forum where there's a little more time. But this paper is publicly available, so I encourage you to go read it if you're on the engineering side of the house. So we've got about 5 minutes left, so I think I'll just wrap up here. I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me. Computer security is always going to be a challenging property to achieve, but it's not impossible. And the good news is you can actually plan ahead to protect against unknown unknowns by having a solid threat model that's scientific and refutable, not simply statements of opinion. And there's a lot I'm doing within FDA to help move this along, helping with our internal training, working with many of our stakeholders across the medical device and cybersecurity ecosystem and forums such as this, but also spending quite a bit of time on the US side, within the US federal government, to help connect the dots between different agencies that have some equity in helping to protect medical devices so that they remain safe and effective.